and I have a kitty. So there's a kitty with me as well. Gonna give a few minutes here for people to join in. I apologize for not reading yesterday. I had posted earlier that I'd read today, and I was just getting settled, and we had some company, so I'm just now have some time to sit down and get my book out. So don't mind the kitty cat, because the kitty cat, I guess, has decided it's her time. So I guess she wants to listen to the story as well. I'm going to read the first book in the Mapmaker Chronicles series, Race to the End of the World by A.L. Tate. It's a Kane Miller publishing. It's a Kane Miller book. And I get them through Usborne, so you can get these from me. So if you like it, I can hook you up with the books. They're just like about $6 a piece. And there are 3 books. So this is the first book. And then, yeah, watch out for the kitty, because this is the second book, Prisoner of the Black Hawk. And then the third book, Breath of the Dragon. So yes, this is the Mapmaker Chronicles series, so it'll be about $18 for the whole set. So if you like it and you want to get the book, again, you can just contact me, or my my order page is in the link. But if not, that's fine. I am just here to spread literacy and joy of reading and introduce you to a series that you might enjoy and you would like. And again, join me on Tuesdays. I've been reading the Anne of Green Gables series, about almost, not quite halfway, but almost halfway through the first book. I think I might add in an extra day or so, because it's a long time to wait between the books, and I have some extra time, so I've been thinking of adding in an extra day during the week to read. So I'm just going to read first 2 or 3 chapters here, depending on how long the chapters are. I have not read these books yet, so this will be new for me. I'm just going to read the synopsis, so if people want to join in, they won't miss a lot. So I'm just going to read the synopsis while we wait to let people join in. A map of the world? Why did the king want that? Everyone knew if you went too far in either direction, you'd fall off the edge into the jaws of Genocide, the fire-breathing dragon. The king had promised a prize to the ship's captain who can bring him a map of the whole globe. To do that, they'll need map makers, and farm boy Quinn is shocked to be one of those chosen. Quinn is content with his quiet life, but when the king's advisor discovers the special talent he has tried to keep secret, he has no choice but to join the ragtag crew of slaves and stowaways on the Libertas. On board, Quinn faces the greatest challenges he's ever known, from the strange sea monster hot on their trail to the other competitors who will do anything to win. But the greatest danger may be lying in wait just off the edge of the map. All right. So, prologue. His father was sending him away. Quinn Freeman backed away from the door, stepping carefully to avoid the squeaky floorboard near the stairs. His mam always told him that listeners heard no good of themselves. Maybe she was right. When he'd spied Master Blough at the door of their cottage earlier, with that huge dislander behind him, Quinn had been curious enough to leave his cozy hiding spot in the corner of the hay barn to creep inside. Now he wished he'd stayed there, tucked up with his book and his thoughts. His father had never found him there before. Was it too late to hide now? "Quinn!" he heard his father call from the other side of the door. "Quinn!" Silence. Quinn hardly dared to breathe. He was supposed to be out in the chicken coop, clearing out the mucky hay and freshening the water. "Quinn!" his father shouted again, rising impatience evident in the roar at the end of Quinn's name. "Blasted, where is that boy?" Soft murmuring inside suggested his mam was answering. Quinn froze. What to do? If he went inside, his fate was sealed. If he stayed out here, his fate was sealed. If he hid... The wooden door slammed open, ricocheting against the whitewashed wall with force. "Quinn!" his brother Jed bellowed before spotting Quinn cowering by the stairwell. "Oh, there you are," he said in his normal tone, which was about one stage lower than a bellow. "Come here!" He reached out and grabbed Quinn by the ear. Jed was the oldest of Quinn's 5 brothers, who were all older than him, and never let an opportunity to remind him of that fact go by. Most of those opportunities involved some form of physical punishment, because, besides being older, Quinn's brothers were all bigger than he was. Much, much bigger. Even Alan, who was only 18 months older. The runt of the litter, his father called him. The baby, his mother called him. Quinn wasn't sure which was worse. "Father wants a word with you," said Jed, continuing to drag Quinn through the door by his ear and delivering him to their father's seat by the fire. The best seat in the house. The only seat with any kind of cushioning. Quinn's seat was a stool over in the farthest reaches of the large, low-ceilinged room. He didn't mind. It was quieter in the corner. And now, with special guests, the room was full of noise. All his brothers were there, even with plowing needing to be done. As usual, they were all talking at once. The only stillness in the room was his mother, sitting beside her husband, eyes on the floor. "Master Blough is going to take you with him," his father announced over the top of the hubbub, looking Quinn up and down. "He's looking for boys for a... what is it again?" The huge farmer turned to look at the stooped, wrinkled man currently perched on the edge of Quinn's mother's seat, the second best seat in the house. The Dislander stood behind him, watching. "Hello, Quinn," said the soft-spoken old man. "I've heard a lot about you." Quinn raised his eyebrows. Nobody talked about him. Not ever. Well, not unless they were teasing him. "Oh," he managed. "The king has asked me to find 10 boys for a special school," the man continued. "I believe you are to be one of my boys." A school? Quinn was really confused now. Farmers' sons didn't go to school, not in Verdania, not even the sons of freehold farmers like his father. School was for the nobility, the rich, as his father told him every day. Boys like him were born to work on farms, like their fathers before them. The only reason Quinn could read was because of his mother. She'd had schooling as a girl, long before she'd met and married Bayard Freeman, when her father had been at court, before he'd been stripped of his titles and his lands. Not that they talked about that, but she had taught Quinn to read, the only one of the 6 boys. By the time Quinn had come along, his father had 5 sons to help him around the farm. Something had happened when Quinn was born, and his mother couldn't have more babies. This meant she'd never have a daughter, so his father had given Quinn to his mother, to keep her company, from what he could gather. Because of that, Quinn could cook, he could darn a sock, and he could read. The reading thing was the trade-off for all the for all the teasing that Quinn copped from his brothers and the other boys in the village for being a mammy's boy. He hated that. But he loved books, and his mam had a deal with the local cleric to keep him supplied. She baked bread and made jam for the cleric, and he sent Quinn 2 new books a month. Precious books. His mam had warned him that if anything ever happened to one of those books, they'd all be evicted from their farm, freehold or not, because it would cost that much to replace it. So he took great care of every volume, hiding them from his brothers, who simply didn't understand their value. "At this stage it's just for 3 months," Master Blau said, frail voice cracking. "But if you do well, much longer." "If you do well, you'll get to go off on adventures," interrupted Jed. At 21, Jed didn't always see eye to eye with their father. Quinn knew Jed was keen for a few adventures of his own, but their father had made it quite clear that Jed's place was on the farm. Quinn frowned. He didn't like the sound of adventures. At 14, he did not share Jed's desire to leave Markham. Not at all. He wanted to stay here with his family and his books. He loved the little cottage with its whitewashed walls and thatched roof. His brothers drove him mad, but they were also great fun when they wanted to be, and he always felt safe with them. Nobody messed with the Freeman boys. Now, let's not put the cart before the horse," said his father. "Only 3 boys will do that, and he'll be competing with nobility and all." Quinn's frown deepened. What the blazes was going on? He turned to look at his mam, eyes searching her face for answers. She looked tired and drawn, and wouldn't quite meet his gaze. "Allow me to explain," said Master Blau. "King Oral has called upon me to find the 10 most promising students in the land to train as map-makers. He has decided that Verdania will create the first map of the world." Map of the world? Why did he want one of those? Besides, everyone knew that if you went too far in either direction, you'd fall off the end of the earth. They also knew that below the drop lay Genocide, dragon of death, waiting. Quinn had spent his whole life hearing stories of genocide. "Why would he want that?" asked Alan. "It's not much bigger than Aldistan, Gelen, and Firenze, is it?" Quinn saw the big Deslander wince at the comment. Quinn wasn't entirely sure where Desland was, but he knew it was somewhere well beyond the boundaries of Firenze. People still talked about the time the men of the village had gone to fight in the Crusader Wars 20 years earlier, and had been gone the better part of 5 years. 5 years suggested there was a bit of travel involved. "The king has heard that Gelen is planning to develop such a map," said Master Blau in the casual tone reserved for those who dealt with matters of state all the time. "The king does not wish Gelen to have more knowledge than we do." Quinn could understand that. It hadn't taken him long to work out that knowledge meant power. His brothers might be physically stronger than he was, but he knew more about history and seasons and, well, just about everything than they did. They could only know what they saw or heard. He could read the thoughts of scholars and clerics and prophets and storytellers. Given time, he could know everything. Okay. "Why me?" Quinn asked, the first words he'd spoken since he'd been dragged into the room. "Cleric Redland told us about you," said Master Blau. "We have been in contact with every cleric and tutor and master in the kingdom, looking for the right boys for our project." Once again, Quinn turned towards his mother. He'd only met Cleric Redland a few times. Mostly his mother took care of book deliveries and drop-offs. What could Cleric Redland possibly know about him that meant he'd be dragged into this? "He knows about your memory," she said quietly. "I told him." Quinn blanched. He'd been only 4 when his family had realized that he had a strange quirk. They had been sitting around the long wooden table in the kitchen as his mother had served up a particularly delicious stew of lamb and potatoes. His father, a man who usually focused on his food, had been feeling sentimental that night and had asked his wife if she remembered the dinner poem, as he called it. She laughed. "I haven't recited that in years," she said. "I don't think I'd even remember where to start." And sitting on his stool at the bottom of the table, Quinn had calmly begun to speak. "Where, oh, where is my dinner?" cried the little snake. "I know I left it here somewhere. I slept, now I'm awake. I've looked all over, up and down, everywhere I've tried. Oh, wait, I think I found it here, tucked up in my insides. Oh, where is my dinner?" cried the little. He'd gotten no further than that before the room erupted. It was a poem he'd heard only once, at least 2 years before. After that, it hadn't taken them long to realize that Quinn remembered everything. Everything. From what they'd had for dinner on any given night 6 months before, to every single word he read. He could describe in detail the contents of each peddler's cart that regularly visited the farm, and when they were last there, so that his mother could work out how best to spend her money. And he knew by heart every recipe she'd ever made. When he'd gotten older, his father had asked him how he did it. As best he could explain, it was as though he had a stack of pictures in his mind, and he simply flicked through them until he found the one with the information he wanted. His family was used to it now, but they were careful to keep the secret of Quinn's memory from the rest of the village. Quinn knew that not everyone would be as understanding of something that couldn't be explained. He'd never forget the sight of his friend Aisha's mother being hounded out of the village by a group of angry masked villagers because she couldn't explain why her plant remedies cured illness when doctors couldn't. Despite her pleas, despite the fact that the villagers had known her for years, nothing she'd said could convince them that she was no witch, no threat. And so Serena, Aisha's mother, had left, weeping under a hail of sticks and stones. Quinn had run as fast as he could to get his own mother, but they hadn't seen Serena or Aisha since. And now here was this old man discussing his memory like it was an everyday thing. "Your mother says you can read and write," Master Blau was saying. "I think you have the makings of a fine candidate for the project." "I don't want to go," said Quinn flatly. "I want to stay here." His mother started sobbing. "You don't get to choose," his father told him, no expression in the hazel eyes that were so similar to Quinn's own. "We don't get to choose. Master Blau has chosen you, and that's that." Master Blau laughed softly. "Well, there's no need to be dramatic about it," he said before turning to look directly at Quinn. "The fact is that it takes a special person to create maps. There are very few candidates available, and the king is most, adamant that I get this program underway as soon as possible. Besides," he paused, looking around the humble living room of the cottage intently. Quinn tried to see it through his eyes. One long, low room with heavy dark wooden beams across the ceiling, flagstone flooring, simple wooden furniture, a large open hearth at one end. It wasn't much to look at, he realized, but it was home. "Each boy who is chosen to undertake the journey will be paid," Master Blau is saving. "A stipend of 20 ducats a month while he is away, a bonus of 500 ducats on his return, and the granting of a parcel of land should his ship prove to be the winner." Quinn's mouth dropped open. 20 ducats was more than his father made in a year. The rest constituted riches beyond his imagination. He could see why his father was so keen for him to go. With 6 sons and a small land holding, Bayard Freeman was going to struggle to find work for them all. With all that money and extra land, well, the sky was the limit. Quinn stole a quick glance at his brothers. Jed was looking at him with open envy, Simon with longing. Quinn knew that he had his eye on the blacksmith's daughter, Marin, and he knew that Simon had no chance whatsoever in his current state as second son of a farmer. The others, Heath, Barrick, and Allen, simply looked bemused. He knew they'd never imagined a time ever that it would be he, Quinn, who held the family's fortune in his hands. "So you see, Quinn," his father said, "there's really no choice. You must go to Master Blau's school, and you must do your best." Quinn sighed as he stared at the floor. He couldn't argue with his father. He wanted the best for his family, too. Besides, there'd be competition, wouldn't there? "Who else is going?" he asked, raising his eyes and addressing Master Blau directly for the first time. "Most of the others are sons of noblemen," the old man said. "One is a cleric's fosterling. And you?" Quinn exhaled with relief. It would all work out, because frankly, he had no chance to be chosen as one of the 3 scribes. He'd heard that the children of nobility were schooled in everything from languages to swordplay, every day from the age of 8. He couldn't imagine such luxury. Surely his mother's sporadic reading and writing lessons couldn't compete with that. "What happens to those who are not chosen?" he asked. If he had to go away, Quinn hoped it would benefit his family in some way, even if it was a waste of time. Master Blau laughed. 10 ducats a month for 3 months for each boy who attends the school," he said. More than a year's farm income. It would help a great deal, given the season they were having. The previous winter had been hard, and the spring hadn't brought its usual heavy rains. It was now the beginning of summer, and the crops were struggling, and Quinn had heard his father and Jed talking long into the night about what they were going to do. He looked at his mother. She had stopped crying. She knew as well as he did what he needed to do, but he needed her support to do it. She nodded before giving him one of her slow, sweet smiles. "You'll be chosen," she told him. Everyone laughed. "There you are," his father said. "Your man's never wrong, so you might as well pack your bag." Quinn managed to smile. His father was right. There was no choice in this, not for him. His family needed him to go and to do his best. He was the only one of them who could do it, so do it he must. As far as being chosen, though, well, he couldn't be as sure of that as his mam was, and he couldn't help but hope she was wrong, just this once. In the meantime, though, he might as well try to enjoy the fact that he'd be doing exactly what he loved for 3 months, reading, writing, learning. How bad could it be? Chapter 1. 3 months later. If Quinn had had a worse day, he couldn't remember it. And given that he remembered everything, he was pretty sure that meant this was the worst day ever. It had begun that morning before the sun had even thought about lighting the sky, and had continued through a long day of pushing, shoving, and snide remarks, and here he was in the dark with the moon full and the mid-hour almost upon him, and it was still unfolding. Worst of all, it all came down to one thing, or one person, rather. Ira. From his first day at scribe school, as the king had deemed it, Ira had decided that Quinn didn't belong. The fact that Ira was probably right didn't make it any easier when he decided to make Quinn's life a living nightmare, to prove his point. The tall, blond boy took every chance to make Quinn look bad, and there were many chances. Given his position as the son of a lordling, Ira should really have had better things to do with his time. All the other noble boys in the group went out of their way to ignore Quinn, to the point where they would simply walk over the top of him if he got in their way. But not Ira. He'd made it clear from day one that he was personally affronted by the fact that a farmer's son had been selected for the school. The fact that Quinn had proved himself more than capable of keeping up in class, which had surprised nobody more than Quinn himself, had only added to the problem. Ira, with his fancy leather breeches and his soft, fine-weave tunics, poked fun at Quinn's coarse, homespun clothing. He had only 2 sets, while Ira seemed to have new clothes to wear every day. Quinn didn't mind that. He could picture his man weaving the cloth for his simple tunic, then sewing it by hand, each stitch tinier than the next. He'd sewn part of the breeches himself, not that he'd be sharing that information with Ira. His mam had shown him how to turn the seams and how to create the little loops with which the breeches were fastened. Unfortunately, he was now wondering if he'd ever see those breeches again. At present, he was sitting, shivering in the dark in 2 inches of cold, grimy water. His breeches, which he'd set next to the bath when he'd climbed in half an hour before, were somewhere else in the castle. Ira and his gang had snuck into the tower washroom and stolen all Quinn's clothes as he had his weekly bath, which he only took at this late hour in an attempt to avoid them. So much for that. They hadn't even left him with a drying cloth, and had blown out all the candles and locked the door on the way out, leaving Quinn alone and naked in the dark. He'd sat there, stunned, while valuable minutes ticked by. There was one thing Quinn hated. It was the dark. Even if he could work out how to break down the solid wooden door, he would need to navigate the narrow circular stone staircase that led down to the dormitory wing where he and his fellow students lived, and he certainly wasn't going to do that naked. Gingerly, he stood, feeling the cool water run down his legs and drip into the tub. He could just about see his hand in front of his face if he held it at the very end of his nose. Feeling for the lip of the tub, he lifted one leg out onto the cold stone floor. It was slippery under his wet feet. But now that he was out of the high tub, he could see a line of light leaking in under the door. He immediately felt better. There had been no light before. Quinn had been enjoying his late bath, a luxury for a boy who shared a washtub full of water once a week with the 7 other members of his family, trying to calm his nerves for the next day. Decision day. All the lights in the other dormitory rooms had been out as he'd climbed the stairs, and he'd assumed everyone else was asleep. Clearly, he'd been wrong where Ira was concerned. He could only hope that the light he could now see was not Ira waiting at the bottom of the stairs for Quinn to try to escape. He moved toward the door and hammered on it. "Help!" he said. "Help!" He paused, listening hard to see if anyone was coming. Were those footsteps on the stairs? He hammered again, stopped, heard the shuffle of feet outside the door. "Is someone in there?" a voice whispered. Quinn breathed a sigh of relief. Ajax, the cleric's fosterling, was a large, friendly boy with a huge, contagious smile. Ira and his gang left Ajax alone, mostly, Quinn thought, because the size of him terrified them. He reminded Quinn of his brothers, the same knockabout manner and the same interests, games, girls, and doing as little work as possible. Quinn had initially wondered how Ajax had found himself in the group of 10 students. He didn't seem the studious type, and he didn't have the benefit of background that Ira and his gang had. What Ajax did have, Quinn had learned over time, was an ability to turn his hands to any practical task and the constitution of an ox. Ajax wasn't the quickest student at the school, either physically or mentally, but he was unfailingly good-natured, and he had a surprising talent for drawing, adding quirky little touches to his work. Add to that his red hair, which everyone knew was a good luck omen, and Quinn thought Ajax was pretty much a shoo-in to be chosen for the great race as it had come to be known. Another redhead. And it says redheads are a good omen. Yes, we are. Sorry, back to the book. Great race. Even the words had the ability to make Quinn shudder. Mind you, it could simply be cold that was making him shiver violently now. "It's me," he whispered. "Quinn. I'm stuck in here." "Oh," said the big redhead. "I see. Someone's locked the door. Who would do such a thing?" He sounded genuinely outraged. There was one thing Ajax hated. It was unfairness. It doesn't matter, Quinn said now, knowing that the last thing he needed tonight was to escalate his troubles with Ira. But can you let me out? Of course, said Ajax, and Quinn could hear him turning the key in the lock. Just it's a bit stiff. You're what? Ajax said, obviously concentrating hard on the task at hand. I've got no clothes, Quinn said louder. You'll have to get me something to wear. As he said the last words, Ajax finally got the key to work, flung the door open, and rushed into the room, right into Quinn, sending him flying backward. There was nothing like having your naked buttocks hit cold stone at speed to really top off a terrible day, thought Quinn as he sat, splayed on the floor, blinking up at Ajax as the light hit his eyes. Oh gosh, sorry, the redhead said. Oh, but wait, you're nude! Here! With that, he peeled off the nightshirt he was wearing, leaving him in an undershirt and drawers. Quinn stood slowly, took the shirt, and dropped it over his head, where it swallowed his entire body, right down to his ankles. Thanks, Ajax, he muttered. I'll just go and change and bring you your shirt back. Before you go, let me show you a trick, the larger boy offered. Quinn eyed him warily. He was cold, tired, and facing another long, trying day in a matter of hours. Now was probably not the best time for a trick of any description, but Ajax had been helpful. Before I went to live with Cleric Fennelly, I was in an orphanage, he was saying, as chatty as though the two of them were sitting in one of Queen Lorelei's parlors drinking honeyed tea. The guardians used to lock us in our rooms all the time, so we learned how to get out of them. Let me show you. With that, he turned back to the door. I'll show you, and then I'll lock the door, and you can try it, he said. The trick is to try to open the door from the other side. It's not as easy when you're naked, of course, but most of the time you'll have something in your pocket that will help. Let me just have a look around here and see if I can find... Ha! He had been crawling about on the floor, feeling with his fingers, and now stood triumphantly with a thin sliver of one of the floor stones in his hand. He turned to the door, and rather than going to the handle, approached the other side. What you want to do is to remove the hinges, he was saying, demonstrating for Quinn how to use the thin sliver of stone to turn the screws in the hinges. That way, you don't draw attention to yourself, and rather than wasting energy trying to shove at a door that won't move, you simply open it from the other side. Quinn watched in fascination as the hinges came free and Ajax was able to pry the door open from the wrong side. Right, said Ajax, turning to Quinn. Your turn. With that, he screwed the hinges back on, attaching them once more, and then went through the door. Quinn set to work on the hinges with the little rock that Ajax had given him, and within minutes felt the hinges come free. He opened the door to Ajax's 100-decker grin. Well done, the larger boy said, clapping Quinn across the back and knocking the breath out of him. Now you've done it once, you'll never forget it. Quinn stilled. No one at the school had any idea about his memory. Master Blau told him on the way to school 3 months earlier to keep it a secret. Not that Quinn needed telling. He could just imagine the response of Ira and the others if his freakish feats were revealed. So he'd made sure he'd asked questions in class, even when he knew the answers, because he'd read them or been told them before. Had he somehow given himself away? But Ajax looked at him with complete innocence. It was just an expression. He smiled back at Ajax, who took the stone and quickly screwed the door hinges back into position. Never leave them loose, he told Quinn. You don't want to give away your secrets. Quinn laughed for the first time in months. No, he agreed. It wouldn't be right to do that. Okay, then. We'd best get to bed, said Ajax. Big day tomorrow. Decision day. Tomorrow, the 3 explorers selected by King Oral to compete for the honor of mapping the world would choose their scribes. Armed with compasses, rulers, precious vellum, ink, and all the knowledge that Master Blau had been able to cram into their heads in 3 months, the boys would undertake the task of creating beautiful, precise records of the world around them. They weren't starting from scratch, of course. Verdania had a healthy tradition of map making, and map makers like Master Blau had created a series of detailed maps of the kingdom and those around it, such as Firenze and Glen. Quinn had even seen a hasty map drawn by one of the brave soldiers from the Crusading Wars, which showed the path they had taken to Deslan. He'd been surprised to see that the soldier Dolan had allocated spaces to other kingdoms along the way. At the time, nobody had stopped to do any exploring, so there were no details about what those kingdoms were, nor who lived there, but the soldier had taken care to mark the rivers and mountains they'd passed, and had detailed a small section of coastline. Was that the beginning of the end of the earth? Quinn hoped he never had to find out. The more he learned about map making, the more he'd realized it wasn't for him. Although one side of him loved it, he took great pride in his maps, drawing each detail with care, and adding illustrations where he thought they would make things clear. He'd often seen Master Blau looking approvingly at his work. But it is one thing to create beautiful maps, and quite another thing to realize what those maps represented. For all the maps Quinn had seen had ended. The land gave way to vast swaths of blue water. Just how big, no one knew. But Quinn had seen enough to know that the direction of travel for this expedition was all wrong. The direction of the ocean currents and the winds was wrong, aiming to push any ship backward, meaning any progress would be slow and dangerous. As well, sailors who had ventured out beyond the boundaries of current maps reported vicious storms and ferocious oceans. Frankly, he couldn't see how any expedition would last beyond a week. On top of that, while Master Blau had spent countless hours discussing with him in the class the latest theories about why the earth was round, Quinn wasn't entirely sure he believed it. If the earth was round, just how did all of that water stay in place? And if the earth was round, just where was it? He would lie on his back in the palace gardens staring up at the sky. The sky was up, the earth was down. If you dug a hole, you went down further. To hell, the cleric said. If the earth was round, that meant that somewhere the sky was below him, and that if you dug a hole and kept going, you'd eventually get to the other side. Seriously, it made his brain hurt just to think about it, and it made him want to take his 30 ducats and go home to the farm where nobody talked about the possibility of sailing off the end of the earth. "Do you want to be chosen?" he asked Ajax. He hadn't had this conversation with anyone since he'd been at the school. With some, you didn't need to. Ira and his gang were convinced they were going to be chosen. Ira was constantly telling everyone what a great kickstart to his knight's career the whole exercise was going to be. He'd made it clear from day one that he was simply filling in time before he could become a squire at 16. There were others who you could tell were simply not going to be chosen, like Anders, a shy, pimply boy of 13 who slept with a small felt doll every night and who'd been ill 3 times since his arrival at the school. He was incredibly bright, with a great knowledge of the stars, but Quinn couldn't see how he'd even leave the harbor without needing a doctor. Master Blau had told them all that the explorers were looking for a combination of skills, health, and tenacity in their scribes. Each of them was different, he'd said, so their own opinions on the importance of those things would, of course, factor in, but Quinn would bet that none of them would take a chance on Anders. The journey they were to undertake was a long and arduous one. King Orl's rules stated that to win the race the explorer had to return to Verdania with the most beautiful and detailed map within 1 year. Additional treasure would be looked upon favorably. Quinn had spent some time wondering just how far you could sail on a ship in a year. No matter which way he looked at it, it was farther than he wanted to imagine. Treasure or no treasure, to bring back a beautiful and detailed map, the explorer would also need to bring back his scribe. Losing a scribe halfway around the world was a good way to forfeit the race. Which is why, Quinn thought, looking at the back of Ajax's large head as he followed the other boy down the stairs, Ajax was a shoo-in. He looked indestructible. "I don't really mind one way or the other," Ajax was saying, concentrating on putting one large foot in front of the other. The stairs to the washroom were narrow, and he had to turn his feet sideways to gain solid purchase on each one. "I think it would be fun, to see all those different places and find out what's out there, but I would miss Cleric Fennelly. He's getting old now. I think he needs me at home, though he wouldn't say it. Quinn knew that Ajax had been with the cleric for 4 years. He'd been sent from the orphanage to live with him when the cleric had fallen and broken his hip. Ajax had done his fetching and carrying. It had so charmed him with his innately sunny nature that Cleric Fennelly had refused to send him back when his hip mended, and so Ajax had stayed. "What about you?" Ajax asked. "I don't think I've got much a chance," Quinn said, evading the question, as he'd evaded nearly every personal question put to him during his time at the school. He'd kept himself to himself, partly because he was so homesick, partly to keep his secret, and partly because he spent most of his free time in the palace gardens. But nobody knew about that either. "Oh, I don't know," said Ajax lightly. "Your maps are definitely the most detailed." It was true, Quinn acknowledged silently, mostly because he remembered exactly what he'd seen in the other maps he'd studied. "Yes, but I'm the smallest of the group, bar Anders," he said out loud, trying to convince himself as much as Ajax. "Even my father calls me a runt." Ajax laughed. "My mom always said good things come in small packages," he said. "She died when I was 5, so she didn't live to see me outgrow my small phase, but I always remember her saying that." Quinn managed a smile. "My mam says that too," he said. Ajax stopped on the stair, 3 from the bottom. "You don't want to go, do you?" he asked. He wasn't challenging Quinn, merely interested. Quinn took a deep breath. "Not really," he said. "I didn't even want to come here, but my family needed the money and—" His words trailed away. "Don't you want to see the world?" "Not really," Quinn said again. "I like the part of the world I know." He thought of the flat green fields that stretched out like blankets around the family's stone cottage. He thought of the wide brown river that ran through the tiny village of Markham where he'd been born, and where he knew everyone and they knew him. He loved sailing his little skiff out with the tide, down to collect shellfish at the mouth where the river met the ocean. "Well, hopefully they'll choose someone else then," said Ajax cheerfully. And that was the crux of the matter. Quinn had no say in whether he was chosen or not. He'd kept his promise to his father and done his best, knowing that the money he would earn for being part of the race would matter to every member of his family. But that didn't mean he had to like it. "If you turn up in my nightshirt, you've got a pretty good chance of being left behind," Ajax continued, laughing at his own joke. Quinn looked down at the volumes of fabric swirling at his ankles. "You're right," he answered with his own laugh. "Maybe Ira's done me a favor." Ajax stopped laughing and looked thoughtful. "Ira took your clothes, huh?" he said. "Then come with me. I think I know where they'll be." Quinn followed him down the hall to the scullery at the entrance to the dormitory. "Ira's been flirting with that Brianna who does the washing," Ajax said. "I bet he stashed them in here." Sure enough, after a bit of digging around amongst the unwashed smalls of everyone at scribe school, Quinn had his clothes back. "Thanks, Ajax," he said, as he dropped the redhead off outside his room on his way to bed. "I really appreciate the help." "Any time. It's a shame we didn't really speak until tonight." "Oh, well, I'll be there to wave you off tomorrow as you head out into the big world," Quinn joked. Ajax laughed. "You'd like that, wouldn't you?" "Well, be careful, Quinn. It might be me doing the waving off." The image of Ajax waving him off from the docks as he stood on deck, bound for who knows where, kept Quinn awake for many hours that night. Chapter 2. Despite a restless night, Quinn was awake before dawn, thanks to Ira. The boy had woken early, tiptoed into his room with a full jug of water, and poured it over Quinn's head as he'd done every morning that week. By the time Quinn was up and on his feet, sputtering and soaked, Ira had raced back to his own room. Quinn knew there was no point in chasing him and raising a ruckus. The blond boy would simply put on his most innocent expression and deny all knowledge. Quinn sighed, quickly stripping his wet nightshirt and turning back his blanket to give his sheets the best possible chance to dry during the day. Not that he'd need them again that night. No matter what happened today, he wouldn't sleep in this bed again. He'd either be on a cart heading back to Markham and his family, or on a ship. He'd slid into his breeches and tunic, put his few possessions into the Hessian bag he'd brought with him 3 months earlier, picked up his worn leather boots, and tiptoed down the hall to the back stairs that led from the dormitory wing out of the castle and down into the gardens. Truth be told, he didn't mind being woken early, though he could have done without the icy bath, for it gave him a chance to slip away to the kitchen garden before breakfast. He'd discovered the garden on his second day in the castle, when he'd blundered into it while trying to find the breakfast hall. It was a beautiful walled space, laid out in sectors around a large circular knot in the center. Each sector contained different vegetables, while the knot overflowed with more types of herbs than he'd ever seen. He'd been wandering about, feeling the texture of the different leaves under his fingers, breathing in the different scents released as he did so, when a voice behind him stopped him in his tracks. "Just what do you think you're doing?" "Oh, he turned to face the speaker to explain, when she suddenly shrieked, ran forward, and grabbed him from behind in a hard hug, squeezing the breath from his middle. "Quinn! Oh, Quinn! What are you doing here?" "Aisha!" He tried to speak, but couldn't, as she hugged him even tighter. All he could do was wave his arms about and struggle for air. She wasn't a big girl, dark-haired like him, with blue eyes and a smattering of freckles, but she was a lot stronger than she looked. When she finally released him, babbling 19 to the dozen about how pleased she was to see him, he had to sit down on the low stone wall around the garden knot to catch his breath. "What's wrong?" she demanded. "Aren't you pleased to see me?" He managed to laugh. That was Aisha. She had always been the most forthright girl he'd ever known. They'd met in the village at the Mayfair when they were both 8, and had been friends ever since. He frowned. "Of course I am," he said, if a little surprised. "I thought you were dead. Where have you been all this time? How did you get here? What happened to your ma'am?" Her smile slid away. "She's dead, Quinn. After we ran, well, she got sick. I think they broke her heart. She was just devastated about what happened. We walked and walked and walked, and she got weaker and weaker. We ended up here. Think maybe she thought she'd be safer in a big city." She paused and sank to sit beside him, staring at her feet. He awkwardly put his arm around her. "We'd only been here 3 days when she died," Aisha went on, voice rising to a wail. "She was so weak from walking and so sick." Now the tears started. Quinn started patting her shoulder, not sure what to say. "My poor mother," said Aisha, sniffling and wiping tears from her face. She pulled a square of cotton from her skirt and blew her nose. "Just because those ignoramuses don't understand the healing power of herbs, to turn on her like that, like she's a witch." Quinn wished he knew what to say. He'd known Serena, Aisha's mother, well. She was a kind, quiet woman, more at home with plants and flowers than she'd ever been with humans. She and Aisha had lived in a little hut close to the forest, where they'd kept a few chickens and a large vegetable garden. The pair had lived off the money they'd raised selling what they didn't need. The trouble had all started the previous winter, when the local tax collector's baby son had gone down with a terrible fever. When the usual doctoring, leeches, bloodletting, compresses, had failed to cure the boy, his father had gone in desperation to Serena's door, begging her to help him. She'd resisted at first. She knew that the village didn't look kindly on her potions, as they called them. Her knowledge of plants and herbs had been passed down through her family and reached back to a time that the ladies of the village now called uncivilized. But the man had been desperate, and so she'd brewed up a special blend of herbs and taken it to his house. The next day, the child, who had been at death's door, was sitting up in his basket, cooing at his mother, cheeks rosy with health, and the ladies had not liked it, branding Serena a witch and her knowledge ungodly. After a day or two of muttering, An angry mob, armed with masks and sticks and stones, had gone to Serena's house and driven her from the village. The ladies had applauded. Quinn's mother had been furious at the whole turn of events. She had rushed back to Aisha's house as soon as Quinn fetched her, but they'd been too late. Serena was gone, and so too was Aisha, never to be seen again, until now. "But why are you here?" he asked. She was wearing a dark woolen dress and stiff white apron, like he'd seen on the other servants in the castle. "You work here?" "Yes," she said. "After my mother died, I had no money, and I couldn't think of anywhere else to go, so I came to the castle. Luckily, one of the guards at the gate felt sorry for me and brought me here to work with his wife. I had nothing to go back to Markham for, Quinn. I'm sorry." Quinn nodded, troubled. He hated to think of her going through all of that by herself. "Are you okay here?" he asked. "As okay as I can be," she said. "I have somewhere to live, food to eat, and I get to work with plants every day." He could hear the ache for her mother in her voice. "What about you?" she said. "Why are you here?" He explained about the school and the race. Her eyes widened with every word. "Oh, Quinn, you're so lucky," she breathed. "I'd love to go away like that. Imagine what you might find out there." He couldn't tell her then that he didn't want to go. She'd always been so brave and adventurous, and when he was with her, he was the same. She'd say, "Let's take the skiff out into the harbor and see what's there." And he'd agree. If he were on his own, he'd only go to the mouth of the river and enjoy the view. With Aisha, there was no question of just looking. You had to get into the picture. So he nodded, and they'd spent time together, catching up before the breakfast bell had rung, and they'd gone their separate ways. Since then, they'd met every morning, talking about everything from the plants in the garden to the people in his class. This morning would be their last. He sat on the low stone wall and breathed deeply. The sun was just reaching the garden, and the herbs were waking up for the day, releasing their scent in the crisp morning breeze. He could smell the soft perfume of the lavender, the pungent scent of the rosemary, the fresh tang of mint. Absent-mindedly, he rubbed a sage leaf between his fingers, enjoying the fuzzy feeling on his skin. There was no sign of Aisha yet. He yawned and frowned. Where could she be? She knew that today was the last chance they'd have to speak for a long time. Whether he went to sea, where she wouldn't be able to visit him, or went home to the farm, where she would. But not until the feast of Stephen. It would be at least 6 months before their next conversation. He watched the sun rise over the wall, feeling its gentle heat through his shirt. The days were definitely getting cooler, but he loved autumn, with its bright blue skies and clear mornings. Lost in thought, he didn't realize the passage of time until the breakfast bell sounded. Startled, he sat up and looked around. He'd been sitting here for over an hour, and Aisha hadn't come. Something must have happened to her. He tore over to the back door of the kitchen, asking the scullery maid, who was emptying a large pot of something unidentifiable into the big trough, if she'd seen Aisha that morning. She hadn't. Neither had the footman, the stable boy, the cook, nor any of the other dozen people he asked on his way to breakfast. It was as though she'd vanished. Quinn ate a hurried breakfast of oats and honey, washed down with cold tea before running out the door to begin his search again. Unfortunately, he ran directly into the chest of Master Blough. "Ah, Quinn, I've been looking for you," the old man said. "It's time. The king requests your presence in the counting house for the decision." Quinn gulped. In his mad search for Aisha, he'd nearly managed to forget what day it was, and he knew that "request your presence" was Master Blough's polite way of saying, "orders your presence, right now." Master Blough was accompanied, as always, by the huge Dislander. Quinn had learned that he was the king's personal slave, captured 20 years earlier in the Crusadic Wars. In the ensuing years, the dark-skinned man had been a constant presence by the king's side. Whispers had it that they conducted themselves more as friends than as master-slave when not in public. Now the man, named Zane, was staring at Quinn, as though he could see right through his skin and into his heart. Quinn shivered. With a scarred face and gold earrings, Zane was unlike anyone Quinn had ever known. Perhaps he could see right through people. "Just on my way," he stammered now, in response to Master Blau's statement. Aisha would have to wait until after the decision. With any luck, he'd have 5 minutes to find her before he was dispatched back to the village. "Excellent," said Master Blau. "We'll accompany you there. Just make sure you don't get lost." Quinn shot him a quick look. Master Blau knew of Quinn's reticence to attend scribe school, of course. He'd been there for the conversation with Quinn's family. But Quinn had been careful not to show anything of the sort during his time here. He had done everything asked of him, and more, to ensure that the precious deserts he'd been promised would make it home to his family. All his wishful thinking about not being chosen had been just that, thinking. Perhaps the Dislander was not the only one who could see inside a person's skin. But the old mapmaker was looking serenely ahead, apparently unaware of the internal turmoil in the boy alongside him. Quinn breathed a sigh of relief. All he had to do was maintain the act for another few hours, and he'd be free. There was no way he'd be chosen. No sane explorer would choose the smallest, bar one, of the 10 candidates. Thank you for joining me in the reading of the little excerpt from the first book of the Mapmaker Chronicles. Again, join me Tuesday for the continuation of Anne of Green Gables. I'll probably do shorter reading, but I'll probably add in a few extra days because 2 hours I've learned is a bit long to read. But again, thank you for joining me, and I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you enjoy the book, and keep reading, stay safe,